August 2nd, 216 BC. A plain in southern Italy beside a slow brown river called Aufidus. The sun is going down on the worst day in the history of Rome, and the man who made it that way is standing in a field of the dead. Hannibal has just pulled off something the textbooks called impossible. Outnumbered, on open ground, he wrapped both wings of his smaller army around a Roman force of around 80,000 and crushed it inward until the soldiers in the middle couldn't even raise their swords. Think Battle of the Bastards from Game of Thrones, but with warmer weather. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers are dead in a single afternoon. A consul of Rome lies somewhere in the heat. By every rule anyone in the ancient world understands, the war is over and Carthage has won it. One of Hannibal's officers thinks the same thing, and he wants to finish it tonight. Maharbal, who commands the cavalry, rides up through the bodies with a single idea. Give me the horsemen, and in 5 days you'll eat your dinner as a conqueror on the capital. But Hannibal hesitates, and Maharbal looks at the greatest general of the age and says the line that will chase his reputation for 22 centuries. The gods, he says, don't give all their gifts to one man. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You don't know how to use one. But what if he listens to his trusted officer? What if Hannibal agrees with Maharbal and turns the horses north at dawn, gambling everything on the one city that never believed he'd come? Let's hit Control-Z. Welcome to Control-Z Rewritten, the podcast where we take the biggest decisions in history and ask, what happens if they go the other way? Not random what-ifs, real 50-50 calls with alternatives that were actually on the table. One decision where we hit Control-Z, try it the other way, and see what changes. Let's start with size, because the numbers here are the story. Rome came to Cannae with the biggest army it had ever put in one place, somewhere between 80,000 and 86,000 men, under the two consuls elected that year, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Hannibal had maybe 50,000. His famous war elephants, the one thing everybody remembers about him, were all long dead by this time, so picture none of those. He was outnumbered on flat ground with a river at his back, and he won anyway. The way he did it is the single most studied maneuver in the history of war. Hannibal put his weakest troops in the center and let them bend backward on purpose, slow and deliberate, like a door swinging open. The Romans poured into the gap, smelling a breakthrough, packing tighter and tighter as they pushed. And then the trap shut. The veteran African infantry waiting on the flanks pivoted inward. The cavalry came around the back, and 80,000 Romans found themselves surrounded on every side and crushed together so densely that thousands of them couldn't lift a sword to save their own lives. The killing went on for hours. Every general for the next 2,000 plus years would dream of pulling off another Cannae, and almost every one of them would faceplant trying. How many died is something the ancient writers argue about. The Greek historian Polybius, our oldest source, says 70,000 Romans were dead in an afternoon. The Roman historian Livy says closer to 48,000 killed with another 20,000 captured. Modern historians, who suspect both men were rounding up the way a fish gets bigger each time the story gets retold, put the dead nearer to 30,000. So even if we take the lowest figure on offer, it's still one of the deadliest single days any Western army has ever suffered. And the dead weren't only soldiers. The list at Cannae reads like a guest book for the Roman state. One of the two consuls, Aemilius Paulus, was killed in the crush. So were both of the army's senior treasury officers, 29 of its military tribunes, 2 men who'd already served as consul years before and come back to fight in the ranks, and at least 80 members of the Roman Senate. One modern estimate is that 1 in 5 Roman men of fighting age died in that one battle. The surviving consul, Varro, escaped with a small huddle of men to a nearby town called Canusium, which is going to matter a little bit later in the story. By every rule the ancient world played by, this was a checkmate. A state that lost an army this size, this completely, sued for peace, paid up, and went home smaller. That is simply what came next every time it happened. But Rome didn't do it. Cannae should have ended the Republic. And the strangest fact in this whole story is that it never even came close. For over 2,000 years, military men have replayed that conversation in the field and reached the same verdict. Hannibal blew it, and Maharbal was right. March on the capital, and the war is won. And the scene survives because of one Roman writer, Livy, who set it down in his history about 190 years after the battle. And it is a great scene. The cavalryman promising dinner on the capital in 5 days, the general dithering, that withering little sermon about gifts and gods. But the scene is almost entirely fiction. Polybius, the older and more careful of our two sources, if we're being honest, he's the Greek who actually talked to people alive during the war. He doesn't mention Maharbal at the battle at all. So, not the quote, not the plea, really nothing. And the famous detail kind of gives the whole thing away. Dinner on the Capitol was specifically where Roman generals celebrated after a triumph, the victory parade through the streets. So a Roman author, generations later, has a Carthaginian commander being promised the exact reward a victorious consul would daydream about. So this reads a little less like history and more like Roman fan fiction. Essentially the ancient version of a sports columnist saying the Blazers should have drafted Michael Jordan 20 years after the draft happened. Now the bigger question, the one that actually matters. Even if Maharbal said it, was he right? Could Hannibal have taken Rome? Almost certainly not, and we don't have to guess because he tried 5 years later. In 211 BC, deep into the war, Hannibal finally marched his army right up to the capital, mostly as a bluff to scare a Roman force away from the city he was trying to protect. He camped outside the walls, close enough to see the gates, then shifted to a river 3 miles from the center. And then he looked at what he was facing and left. Rome sat behind a massive ring of stone called the Servian Wall, and he had no siege equipment, which are the giant towers and rams that you need to crack a fortified city, because he'd never managed to drag that kind of gear across Italy. Two details from that visit tell you everything about how worried the Romans were. While Hannibal sat outside their walls, they calmly sold the plot of land his camp was sitting on at a public auction inside the city, and it went for full price. Nobody knocked off a single coin for the enemy army parked on top of it. And in the same stretch, Rome sent reinforcements out towards Spain and marched them right past Hannibal as if he were just weather. He took the hint and he went home. The bluff had failed completely. So the romantic version of this Control Z, the one where Hannibal marches, the walls fall, and Rome collapses in a week, is a fantasy. The man himself proved it, so storming the city was never on the table. This means if we want to actually break Rome, we have to find the real way in. And the real way in was never the walls. Rome survived Cannae for one reason, and it has nothing to do with courage or walls or even the gods. It's the one thing I hate more than anything else: math. Polybius hands us a number, and it's the most important number in this whole episode. In the year 225 BC, a few years before the war, Rome counted up every man it and its allies could theoretically put under arms across the Italian peninsula. The total came back at more than 700,000 foot soldiers and 70,000 cavalry. Now, nobody was ever going to mobilize all of them at once, and Rome never tried. But that was the reservoir. That was the depth of the well from which Rome could draw. Now look at what got poured out of that well and survived. Across the 3 big defeats Hannibal handed Rome at the Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and at Cannae, Rome and its allies lost somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 men, killed or captured, in under 2 years. But the Republic just kept raising armies. For every legion Hannibal wiped out, several more marched up to take its place. At the peak of the fighting, Rome had something like 230,000 men under arms at once. As Hitler learned against the United States more than 2,000 years later, you just can't bleed a country like that to death. There's always more. But that reservoir had a secret, and the secret is the key to this story. Most of those men weren't Romans. Rome by itself was a single city. The 700,000 men came from a web of alliances built up across Italy over centuries. So dozens of cities and tribes and peoples, and that includes the Latins and the Samnites and the Campanians and all of the rest, all bound by treaty to send soldiers whenever Rome called. Historians call this network the Confederation. The Allies supplied most of the infantry in a Roman army and almost all of its cavalry. The depth of that well was Italian, not just the citizens of a town, and a reservoir you don't fully own is one somebody can take from you. So that's the real Control-Z button here, and Maharbal never saw it. You don't beat Rome by knocking down its walls or even by smashing its legions, because Hannibal did that 3 times over and it changed nothing. You beat Rome by breaking the Confederation. Pull away the allies, and the 700,000 collapses to the population of a single city. And suddenly, all of that famous Roman stubbornness has nobody left to march. And the maddening part, if you're Hannibal, is that it was already starting. After Cannae, the Confederation did crack, just in the wrong places. The breaks ran through the south. So Capua, the second biggest city in all of Italy, sitting on the rich farmland of Campania, went over to Hannibal, and on its own, it could field 30,000 foot and 4,000 horse soldiers. Losing it hurt Rome about as badly as losing the battle had. And then others followed it out the door. Most of the Samnites, the Lucanians, the Brudians, a string of Greek towns down south, and then the great city of Syracuse over in Sicily the next year, and the port of Tarentum 2 years after that. Even Philip V, the king of Macedon across the Adriatic, signed a deal with Hannibal to grab a piece. The core held, though, so not one Latin colony defected. All of Latium stayed loyal, so did the cities of Naples and Nola, so did the toughest of the Samnites and the Umbrians and the Etruscans up north. The defections, for all of the panic they caused, added up to fewer than a dozen communities that really mattered. And the most telling loyalty of all came from the little town called Canusium, sitting practically next door to the battlefield. If you remember, this is where the consul Varro had fled, looking out at the smoke of the worst defeat in the Republic's history and choosing Rome anyway. That loyal heart of the Confederation is the one thing Rome could not afford to lose. And this is exactly where we're going to aim the Control-Z. It's the autumn of 216 BC, and this time, Hannibal turns toward Rome. He knows he can't storm it the same way he'll know in the real timeline in 211 BC. He marches as a psychological weapon. Think about what the city looks like from the outside right now. Both consular armies are gone, erased at Cannae. There's no Roman field force left anywhere in Italy, nothing standing between Hannibal and the gates except a few thousand shell-shocked survivors hiding behind stone. So he brings his army into the heartland every ally had been promised Rome would always protect. He sits down in front of the capital and starts burning. Week after week, he torches the fields and the farms of the Latin colonies, the loyal core, the well itself, and nobody marches out to stop him because there's no one left to send. Every week he sits there unopposed, he broadcasts one message to every wavering ally in Italy in letters of smoke. Rome cannot protect you. Rome cannot even protect itself. And this is the hinge of the whole timeline, so I want to be honest about it. We know from Rome's own historians that the allies started to waver after Cannae. Livy says it flatly. Up to that day, the loyalty of the allies had held firm, and now, for the first time, it began to slip for no other reason than that they'd started to believe Rome was finished. That doubt was real, and it was already spreading. Now, in the timeline we actually got, the loyal core felt that doubt, but then they gritted their teeth and held. And we know how close even that came to snapping, because 7 years later, in 209 BC, 12 of Rome's 30 Latin colonies sent word that they were tapped out, that they couldn't send one more man or one more coin. The bedrock of the Confederation was cracking from exhaustion, even in the version where Rome wins. So the bet we're making is simple. The march puts that doubt on steroids, and it does it at the worst possible moment, in those raw days right after Cannae, when the wound is open and the fear is total, instead of years down the road when Rome has had time to steady the room. A conqueror sitting at the gates with no enemy army in existence is a far louder argument than the same general roaming around the distant countryside. And this time, the core cracks. The Latin colonies, watching their own fields burn with no rescue in sight, start cutting their own deals to survive. The central Italian allies follow, and as they peel away, the 700,000 strong force drains toward the population of one stunned city. Now, Rome being Rome, it doesn't surrender. This is the part everyone gets wrong about the Hannibal shows up and Rome panics story. Rome did not panic, ever. We know exactly how it answered Cannae in real life, and it's one of the most stubborn things any society has ever done. Hannibal sent an envoy, a nobleman named Cartholo, to discuss terms. The Roman dictator wouldn't let him through the gate and sent a runner ordering him to be gone by nightfall. The Senate voted that it wouldn't ransom its own soldiers captured in the battle, breaking centuries of custom, then went further and forbade families from buying back their own sons. They made it illegal to say the word peace out loud. They dropped the draft age down to boys, they signed up convicts, and they armed 10,000 slaves with the promise of freedom if they fought. This is a city that had its army annihilated and answered by declaring that the word for giving up was now against the law. But all of that famous Roman willpower doesn't help if there's nobody left to fight with. Stubbornness is not a weapon. You can refuse to say the word peace all you like, but if the Confederation is gone and the well is dry, refusing to quit just means losing slowly instead of quickly. The will is total, but completely useless at the same time. The other half of this story is happening 400 miles away, across the sea in Carthage, and it's the half that decides whether the gamble actually pays. Carthage, for most of the real war, was barely backing its own greatest general. It was a republic run by competing rich families, and its politics split into two camps, roughly a war party and a peace party. The war party was led by Hannibal's own clan, called the Barcids. The peace party was led by a man named Hanno, who thought the whole conflict was a mistake and spent years quietly choking off the reinforcements Hannibal kept begging for. And the thing is, Carthage had the receipts to make a different choice. After Cannae, Hannibal sent his younger brother Mago home to ask the Senate for men and money, and Mago made the case in the most theatrical way you can imagine. He'd had soldiers strip the gold signet rings off the fingers of the dead Roman noblemen at Cannae, thousands of them, and he walked into the Senate chamber and dumped the whole glittering pile out onto the floor. There's your evidence, he's saying. Every one of these was a Roman aristocrat, and they're all dead. By some accounts, the Senate cheered and voted to send help. But Carthage hedged anyway, and in real life, this cost it the war. It never committed everything to Italy. It was also fighting in Spain and in Sicily and Sardinia all at once, spreading its money and men thin across the whole map, instead of pouring it into the one front where Hannibal was actually beating Rome. The reinforcements that reached him over the years were a trickle when he really needed a flood. In our alternate timeline, that hesitation evaporates because the whole argument for hesitating also evaporates. Hanno's case for caution always rested on the same point. War is a gamble, fortune turns, so make peace while you're ahead. That's a reasonable thing to say when the outcome is in doubt. It becomes a ridiculous thing to say when the enemy is visibly coming apart, and Rome was visibly coming apart. Its allies were defecting, and the capital was ringed, and there was no army left in the field. You don't sue for peace when you're finishing a kill. So this time, the gold rings work the way Mago wanted. Carthage commits, fully, for the first time in the war, and that trickle of reinforcement becomes the flood that he needs. And the other circling powers, the ones who hedged in real life, jump in hard the second they smell a winner. Philip of Macedon opens his front for real. Syracuse and the Greek cities of Sicily come over, and Sardinia breaks loose. All the pressure that wore Hannibal down to nothing in our timeline now lands on Rome instead. Hannibal never actually wanted to destroy Rome, and we know it from his own paperwork. We have the terms of the treaty he signed with Philip of Macedon in 215 BC, and they don't describe a Rome wiped off the map. They describe a Rome that survives, stripped of its empire and its grip on Italy, knocked down from a superpower to an ordinary regional state. That was the goal the whole time. Break the Confederation, take the navy and the conquests, leave a smaller, humbler Rome behind, and make Carthage the master of the Western Mediterranean. He wanted to win the war, collect the winnings, and go home. So, in the alternate timeline, with the Confederation shattering and the city cut off, Hannibal offers Rome exactly that. A way out. Survive as a minor power, give up the empire and the fleet, bend the knee to Carthage, and live. And Rome says no. Of course it does. This is the same Rome that outlawed the word peace, the same Senate that wouldn't ransom its own captured children, the same city that almost 2 centuries earlier had been physically overrun by Gauls and still refused to pay to make them leave. And that refusal, the very thing that makes the Republic unconquerable in our timeline, is what gets it destroyed in the Control-Z timeline. Because a Rome that won't accept a smaller future leaves Carthage only one option. You can't leave a wounded enemy sitting there refusing terms, nursing its grudge, breeding for the rematch. This wasn't just a flesh wound. Carthage knows precisely what a recovered Rome does, because it's about to find out in real history. So the war doesn't end in a treaty, it ends the only way that it can. Over the next several years, Carthage and its new allies strangle the isolated city. They cut it off, they wear it down, and finally take it. Then they do what, in the timeline we actually live in, Rome would one day do to them. Back in the real timeline, Rome won this war. Hannibal's reinforcements never came in force, his brother was killed bringing an army over the Alps, and a Roman general named Scipio finally beat Hannibal himself in North Africa at a battle called Zama in 202 BC. Carthage was stripped of everything. Its navy was cut to 10 ships, and its empire was gone. And then, 50 years later, the Romans came back to finish the job for good. In 146 BC, after a long siege, they took the city of Carthage, burned it to the ground, and sold the roughly 50,000 survivors into slavery. A senator named Cato had spent his final years ending every single speech he gave on any subject at all with the same 4 words: Carthage must be destroyed. He got his wish. That's the real story. The winners burned the city, enslaved the people, and erased the civilization. Now let's run it backward. In the alternate timeline, it's Carthage standing in the ashes, and it's the Roman world, the one you and I were raised to treat as the bedrock of everything, the one that modern men think about far more often than they should. It's that Rome that gets deleted. In the world where Carthage won, what do things look like? Well, let's start with the words coming out of people's mouths. The language of the Western Mediterranean is Punic. It was the tongue of Carthage. Punic is a Semitic language. It's a close cousin of Hebrew and a more distant relative of Arabic. It's full of sounds and roots that really have nothing to do with Latin. So in this world, from the markets of Spain to the ports of Sicily to the farms of North Africa, people are haggling, praying, cursing, and signing their contracts in a Semitic language, and they're writing it from right to left. Now, the alphabet itself isn't a Roman invention. Rome borrowed it. The 26 letters you would text someone in, the ABC that we use, go back to the Phoenicians, the seafaring people who founded Carthage in the first place. The Greeks took those letters and reshaped them. The Etruscans in Italy took the system from the Greeks, and the Romans took it from the Etruscans. So the alphabet is a hand-me-down of a hand-me-down of a hand-me-down. Carthage wrote in the original. So in the world where Carthage wins, the West skips the whole detour through Greek and Latin and goes straight to the source. The government of this world would look strange to us, but also weirdly familiar. Carthage was a republic, and a genuinely admired one. The most famous political thinker of the ancient world, Aristotle, studied the Carthaginian constitution and ranked it among the best governed states he knew, right alongside Sparta. The place was run by two elected officials called Sufites, chosen fresh every single year, which Aristotle actually preferred to Sparta's hereditary kings. There was a Senate, a citizens' assembly that got the final say when the leaders deadlocked, and a council of 104 judges whose entire job it was keeping the generals from getting too powerful. The Republican idea that the West is so proud of currently, and I'm talking elected leaders, term limits, and checks and balances, is really a Carthaginian one. But it wasn't a perfect system. Aristotle grumbled that the Carthaginians let rich men basically buy their way into office, which is a problem that might sound a little familiar. And one of the men who tried to fix it late in his life by forcing those 104 judges to serve limited terms instead of holding their seats for life was Hannibal himself, the general turned reformer. That fight might also sound somewhat familiar. And the gods of this world aren't the ones carved into marble that we know. The great deities of Carthage were Baal Hamon, the sky father who made the crops grow, and the goddess Tanit, his partner, whose symbol, a simple figure of a triangle with a circle floating above it and arms stretched wide, you would find cut into stone across the whole Western Mediterranean. These weren't strange little local spirits. They came out of the old Phoenician and Canaanite religion of the Eastern Mediterranean. The same deep well of belief the Hebrew Bible spent so much time arguing with. In the world where Carthage wins, the temples that anchor the West belong to Tanit and Baal Hamon, and parents name their children for those gods. The whole shape of it is different, though, because Carthage was never the conquer and assimilate machine that Rome was. It was a trading empire at heart. Carthage ran a web of ports, colonies, and sea lanes stretching from North Africa to Spain to Sardinia to Sicily. They got rich off of shipping, off Spanish silver, off a purple dye worth more than gold, and off farmland so good it fed half the region. So this Western world never gets the Roman thing, the single language and single law stamped onto everyone from Scotland to Syria. It stays more of a patchwork, a commercial network under a Carthaginian crown, looser and more mercantile, held together by trade and money, as opposed to legions and roads. We can barely picture the world Carthage would have built, because the winners erased it so completely that almost nothing survives. A whole civilization came within one battle of running the West, and we know it today mostly through the people who burned it down. Their books, their histories, and their side of every story, gone. We're left guessing. Think about what happened to Carthage's books, and the Carthaginians wrote plenty. Histories, poetry, philosophy, law, religious texts, records of voyages to places no one else had ever sailed. When Rome destroyed the city in 146 BC, it handed the great libraries over to a few friendly African kings, and almost all of it vanished, unread and untranslated. Out of an entire civilization's worth of writing, the Romans decided that exactly one Carthaginian book was worth keeping and translating into Latin, and it was a farming manual. 28 volumes on agriculture by a Carthaginian writer named Mago, no relation to Hannibal's brother of the same name, covering crop rotation and how to make raisin wine and the proper care of bees. That was the only thing judged too useful to burn. And then, over the centuries, even that translation got lost. So today we don't even have the whole farming book. We have a handful of quotes from it scattered together through other people's writing, but that's it. That's all that's left of the losers of this war. Quotes from a book about bees. Even the worst thing historians think they know about Carthage, we can't be sure of for the same reason. For centuries, the headline fact about these people was that they sacrificed their own children, burning infants to the gods when they were desperate. The Greek and Roman writers all reported it. One described 200 children of noble families offered up after a defeat in battle. And sure enough, archaeologists did dig up a precinct at Carthage packed with the cremated bones of infants in urns, marked to Baal Hamon and Tanit. Then, for a stretch of the 20th century, scholars decided the whole story was a smear, propaganda invented by the people who hated Carthage, and the site was just a cemetery for babies who died young, which happened constantly back then. More recently, the weight of opinion has swung back toward thinking some real sacrifice did happen, at least in the worst moments. But we still don't know. And we'll never know because the only people who could have told us their side had their voice burned along with their city. We judge them on the word of the enemies who wiped them out. As the saying goes, history is written by the winners. But two tiny things did survive, and they tell you how total the erasure was. The actual spoken language of Carthage hung on in North Africa for centuries after the city was gone. The great Christian writer Augustine, living there more than 500 years later, still heard Punic spoken around him. And the longest stretch of the Carthaginian language we can still read today comes from a few lines in an old Roman comedy, a play where a Carthaginian character wanders on and speaks in his native tongue, kept around as a punchline for the crowd. This was no minor footnote of a people. Carthage was bigger than Athens. For centuries, it was more important than Rome, the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean, a civilization with a republic Aristotle admired and an alphabet that seeded the world. And we remember it today mostly as a villain in somebody else's story, the enemy that lost, plus a book on how to keep bees. That's what winning does. The side left standing wins the war, and it claims something larger, the power to write down who everyone else was. An officer named Maharbal supposedly told Hannibal he knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one. And for 2,200 years, we've treated that as the great missed chance, the night Carthage could have taken the world and didn't. But sit with the actual history for a second, because the honest verdict is the opposite of the legend. Most historians who studied this think Hannibal was right. Marching on the capital that night probably wouldn't have worked. The city was too far and too strong, his army was too spent, and we knew he couldn't crack those walls because he tried it for real 5 years later and walked away. So the truth is messier and more interesting than he blew it. This entire alternate timeline, this whole world that prays to Tanit and writes from right to left, hangs on one assumption: whether the loyal heart of Rome's confederation cracks with Hannibal at the gates. In real life, it held. Barely. It held through 15 years of hell, through 12 colonies that were tapped out, through doubt already spreading the night of the battle. The most powerful civilization the West would ever build came down to a few Latin towns deciding, in their worst hour, not to quit. That's how close it was. Pull one thread, one town, one season of nerve, and the whole Roman world we were handed never exists. Hannibal never wanted to destroy Rome. His own treaties prove it. He meant to humble the place, take the fleet, take the empire, leave a smaller Rome standing. The burning, the enslaving, the deleting of a whole people, none of that was his plan. Rome's own refusal would have forced it. The bottomless stubbornness that wouldn't ransom a prisoner or even allow the word peace is exactly what leaves Carthage no other way to end it. The thing that made the Republic impossible to conquer is, in the Control-Z timeline, the thing that gets it erased. And the part that stays with you comes after the war is over. The world Carthage would have built doesn't survive in any form we can read. We know its enemy down to the bone. We can name Rome's consuls, quote its speeches, and we can still walk through its ruins. The people who came within one decision of running the Western world left us a religion we argue about, a language we can barely read, and a book about bees. So here's what sits under this Control-Z. We inherited Rome's roads and laws and letters. We also inherited Rome's version of everyone it beat. The winners took the territory. Then they took the memory, kept the parts that flattered them, and the losers became whatever the victors chose to write down. The civilization Hannibal fought for paid the steepest price there is. Beaten in the field, then erased from memory. He won the greatest battle in the ancient world, and he never got to it. Decisions don't get do-overs, but on this show they do. If you like the show, please rate and subscribe wherever you happen to be listening. It helps other people find the show and allows me to understand whether people actually enjoy it. Until next time, I'm Kevin Perez Allen. Thanks for hitting Control-Z with me.